Greetings. It is Friday, finally, July 17th, 2020. And finished out the week. I had nothing scheduled today, but then I had another emergency CPS out in Arlington. So I had to run out to Arlington. So really busy week. But I didn't work as much today, but still it's like, wow, here it is finally in the evening. I did get a chance to have a fabulous phone call with my bestie, Douglas Adams. He called me up to check on me and see how I was doing, and it was great talking to him. We laughed for over an hour on the phone. I was going to start this video sooner, but I ended up talking to him for so long. And, we're still joking about going to Italy because it's so cheap to go there, except that now they won't let us fly to Italy. So he was saying, maybe I'll go down to New Orleans for Southern Decadence. It hasn't officially been canceled yet. He said, it'll probably get canceled, but I may still go just so I can be in a different city. He has an interesting job because he basically is a courier for hospitals and clinics. So he's been slammed having to, because he basically, when you do your COVID-19 test and has to go to the lab, he's the person who takes it to the lab. So he's saying he's been really busy. So we're just talking about maintaining safety and protection and how stupid people are for not wearing masks. He's like, God, this could be solved so easily if just everybody wore their mask. And I was like, I so concur. Anyway, a topic for discussion today. Somebody mentioned on one of the comments on one of the videos that they were wondering about how I became an interpreter. And it was by accident, really. Now, if you follow me, you know that I grew up in Mexico from being a baby on, moved here to the United States to basically when I was almost 15. And so I learned both languages simultaneously. My mother is American. My father is Italian. They were divorced. So I grew up with just my mom, and she spoke English and Spanish. She was bilingual, but she always wanted to speak English with me because she wanted to make sure I learned English. But because she worked, the babysitters and the housekeepers all spoke Spanish because nobody else spoke English where I grew up. So when I learned to speak, I basically learned both languages simultaneously. And the advantage of that is you don't think in a language. You just think, and then you just choose which words you want to use in which language. So I have this natural ability of being able to not even have to process the words. I can just choose. Puedo elegir cualquier idioma en cualquier momento y cambiar de un idioma to the other language without missing a beat, because I just choose which vocabulary to express myself in. So people ask me if I dream in English or in Spanish, and sometimes I dream in English, sometimes I dream in Spanish. And to me, it's just as easy to communicate in both languages because I don't have a dominant language. The advantage of that is it makes the ability to translate quite good. It's easy for me. I don't have to think about it. I just basically repeat what you said, but in another language. And there's two kinds of interpretations. There is consecutive, where you speak, pause, I translate. And there's also simultaneous, like while you're speaking, I translate. Because I don't have to sit there and think of the other language, basically all I'm doing when I do simultaneous is repeating what you're saying. I just happen to be using a Spanish vocabulary if you're speaking English, or if you're speaking in Spanish, I use an English vocabulary. So it's basically like just saying word for word what you're saying, but now I just say it in the other language. So I've had this natural ability to translate my entire life. I did go to school. My first degree is, even though I was a professional ballet dancer, I got a degree in anthropology. And especially ethnology, study of cultures. But part of my degree requirement is I had to study all the four major fields of anthropology. One is medical anthropology. And in that one of the classes that I took, and this is how it ties into being an interpreter, was the nature of aging. And I thought it was going to be how different cultures handle aging process, but it wasn't. It was actually a pre-med course for the medical students. But it applied for the anthropology degree, in which you studied basically anatomy and how every tissue ages in your body, every bone, every muscle, every nerve ending. So it was a very intense anatomy course, and we learned about diseases of aging as well as the aging process. It was the most difficult course I've ever taken in my entire life because it required me to learn human anatomy. That, and then diseases of life as well as infectious diseases. I aced that course, but it was a tough course. And I thought when I finished, I'm never going to use half this knowledge. Little did I know. Flash forward a few years later, I decided to go back to school, get another degree, and I studied Spanish literature. and I focus in medieval Spanish literature, especially the Proto-Spanish language, and or Neo-Ladino, Neo-Latin, which is basically the Vulgate Latin evolving into what was spoken in the early Middle Ages and Middle Ages, in which Spanish was an offshoot. But by learning that base language, most other European Romantic languages emerged from that: Spanish, French, Romanian, Portuguese, etc., etc., etc. So I basically learned the proto language of most European languages in my studies the second time I went back, which made me very able to comprehend not just Spanish, but read 9 other languages besides English. So I have a natural aptitude for languages, because the one thing about a bilingual brain, which is what I have, when you develop 2 languages simultaneously, acquiring a third, a fourth, and a fifth is not that much more difficult, because your brain is kind of wired for it. For me, acquiring a new language is just learning the new vocabulary. And then it just flows out once I learn the vocabulary. And I can understand, because of my knowledge of languages, I can understand most Romance languages and pretty much understand what the person's saying. I can't really speak it, all the other languages, but I can pretty much read them and understand most of when it's spoken to me. And I can communicate some in French, because I did take a few years of French, and then I also studied Italian. Flash forward to 2008. By this point, I had my own theater company. I was translating plays from Spanish and from French into English to produce at my theater. So there was somebody that I was working with, Carol Ann Gordon, and we'd done some shows together, and she was working basically with hospitals, and she basically coordinated for patients who were deceased for organ donation. And she worked at hospitals quite a bit for the company that she worked for, and she said, they're always shorthanded at the hospitals. You ought to be an interpreter. I was too busy with doing my stuff to really follow through on it. But it was kind of in the back of my mind. Well, the financial crash of 2008 happened. And all of a sudden, the massive recession hit. And going to the theater, which is what I had, my business was a theater company, attendance declined significantly. And all of a sudden, instead of doing 5-week runs of shows, I cut them down to 3 weeks. So the amount of revenue was an impact. And I realized, the theater's kind of surviving, paying for itself, but not enough for me to earn money off of it, to live off of anymore. So I need to find a secondary source of income. And I remember Carol Ann Gordon mentioned the hospital. So I applied at Children's Hospital. They never got back to me. Because you had to do it online, and I guess they just never checked their online applications, because they said they had openings, and I applied for it and never heard back. I tried again, didn't hear back. And then she casually mentioned, you ought to check on Craigslist. Well, on Craigslist, there was an opening for Spanish language interpreter to do telephonics with a company out of Washington State. As long as you had a landline at home and got access to the internet, you could work from home. I contacted them, and they immediately were interested, and they said, but we have to test you. So the way these jobs work is you have to contact the company that you're interested in working for, and they usually have a test that you have to take. And it can be done remotely. It's automated. And I remember the very first test, there was multiple tests. But basically, they would give you a word, and then you'd hear a beep on the phone, and then you immediately had like 2 seconds to say the word in the other language. Not enough time to Google it. So you had to know your vocabulary. Because they did a lot of medical stuff over the phone for hospitals across the country, it was mostly a medical terminology. They also did some social services, but predominantly the test was very extensive and very detailed with vocabulary terms and phrases in English and Spanish. So the first test was, in English, 50 words or terms, medical terms in English that I had to translate into Spanish. So that, they start, and these were not everyday words. You had to have some medical knowledge to be able to translate these words. Now, many of them are Latin-based, so some words you can quickly translate, but others you really have to know your stuff. So I'm actually sailing through the test. I'm going through it, and, these highly complex medical terminology and diseases and anatomy phrases. I'm just whipping through the test, and I get to like question 38, and all of a sudden they go elbow. I mean, everything was a multisyllabic, multi-word terminology, and all of a sudden I got elbow. I was so surprised by the simplicity of the word. I blanked. I couldn't think of the word for it in Spanish. And all of a sudden I hear beep. It was too late. And of course, the minute I heard the beep, I went, codo. I mean, this is the simplest word on the test. I couldn't believe I messed it up. And then the next word comes up and it's another multisyllabic long word, which I knew immediately how to say it in Spanish. But I got the giggles because I couldn't believe I missed elbow. So I kind of chuckle a little bit as I'm giving my answer in Spanish to the following word. And then the next word comes up as another multisyllabic, complicated word. But now I realize I giggled on the last response, which I shouldn't have. But now, you know how you get the giggles and you can't stop yourself? I started to giggle through the test because I couldn't believe I missed elbow. And by the time we got to the 50th question, I'm trying to suppress as much laughter as possible. I am laughing as I'm giving my answers because I can't believe I'm recording my voice laughing. I was just like, oh my God, they're not going to hire me. Then you do the reverse. So, you're going from English to Spanish and now Spanish to English. Oh my God. It was the same thing, except near the end, I missed tonsils. Amygdalas. I mean, it was the simplest word. And again, I messed it up. And I just like, they're not going to hire me. I missed the two simplest words on this exam. So it was 100 vocabulary terms, basically. And so I missed two. And I was like, oh God, I'm not going to get hired because who's going to hire me if I don't know how to say elbow or tonsils? So anyhow. The thing is that they immediately grade the test and they call you right back like 15 minutes later with the results. So the lady who was in charge of administering the test calls me up. And before she says, is this Mr. Sonna? She goes, elbow? Really? Which got me laughing. And then she said, and tonsils? And I was like, I know. And she said, I bet you know them now. And I said, yes, because the minute I heard the beep, I knew it was, codo, and I knew amygdalas was tonsils, But it was just like, I can't believe I messed it up. And she said, well, you only needed to get an 80 on these tests, and you got a 98 on both tests. You have a masterful knowledge of medical terminology because we don't expect medical interpreters, to know as much about medicine as obviously you do. Because my God, you just had no problem with most of the vocabulary except for tonsils and elbow. So I passed the test. And then they had one for social services, like for the welfare office terminology that you hear at the social services offices. And that one I got a 100% on. Anyhow, so they sent me a contract. And basically within 24 hours, I was hired. And I was downloaded their system, got their little training video, which is 15 minutes long, of how they operated as a company. And then I started translating the phone. And you have to have a landline. Because they want to make sure the connection is solid and secure, because phone calls, if they're not landlines, tend to drop. And they can't have that if you're in the middle of a major translation with a doctor or social services. So I log in, click on I'm available, and they're open 24/7. If I want to log in right now, I can, because they deal with stuff all over the globe. So I did that for the first several years. And then their business grew quite a bit. In fact, they had me, whenever they were going to try to hire in a new client, they would let me know because they wanted me to, they could always listen in on our calls to make sure we're doing the proper job of translating or of interpretation. And I could tell when they were listening, because you could hear an additional click on the line. But anyhow, they were very happy with me. Next thing they know, we're looking at getting a new client, Blue Shield of California. And would you be available just to they're going to do a test run with us. Would you be available these days, these hours? Because that's when they're going to do a test run with us. And we'd love for you to be on the line. And I was like, okay. They landed that account. Then they called me up and said, there's another company that we're looking at working with. And they're interested in it. And it was actually an home insurance out of Florida. And you seem to have a really large vocabulary. Could we put you on? And a guy helped them get I was also helping procure them accounts, and they were growing, which worked against me because all of a sudden they realized they needed to open a secondary office. They were out of Washington State. They were going to open one in New York because they worked around the clock and the time difference. They realized us at home working we get paid by the minute. That's usually how it is on the phone. You get paid by the minute. But people in house, whenever their in-house interpreters, all their lines were busy, is when the phone calls would go out to us out in the field, which would be me. When they opened the second office in New York, they had like double the staff. So all of a sudden, my phone call levels dropped. I was able to secure all these accounts for them, but then they had to open up another office, and all of a sudden, I in the field, they first, filled up the ones because the employees at the offices were getting paid like regular hourly wages, so they wanted to maximize the use of those interpreters, and then all of a sudden it dropped, and I was like, ooh, not good. So then Frances Munoz, I had done a show with her, and she was bilingual, and she mentioned that she was working as an interpreter in person for a company called Masterword out of Houston, and I should give them a try because I was commenting my workload had dropped so much in the last few months, and it wasn't picking back up, and I finally figured out why. And, the recession wasn't over yet because the recession lasted for quite a while, if you remember, and I was like, I need the income, and it's dropping. So I contacted Masterword. They took forever to hire. They responded really quickly, but to get me set up for testing and so on, I fell through the cracks, and they took forever. But they also have their own set of tests. And theirs was also medical because they did a lot of hospital stuff and social services. And so I took their test. It's a similar thing, except with them, some of it was telephonic, some of it was online because I actually had to translate documents, translate a script, basically. And to determine my language proficiency. Well, they hired me. So with that, I started doing in-person interpretations. And I'll never forget my very first interpretation in person was at Baylor Hospital. They'd interviewed me, and, I went through their training. They had training videos as to how they operate as a company and what their expectations are of their interpreters, because there's different protocols for each company. Some people want you to greet people in a particular way or introduce yourself a particular way, how to handle complaints a certain way. So I went through the little training videos that they sent me. They sent me to my very first assignment at Baylor. It was going to be for a family. It was for post-surgical instructions for the family. So the kid it was at their children's hospital that Baylor had at the time. I was to meet them and then be there for the post-surgical instructions for the family. So I go into the hospital. Hi, my name is Mark Sonna. I'm registering to go in as the interpreter. Followed all the directions they gave me. So we're basically in the recovery room, and the family has just arrived, and the nurse is there, and the kid's still he's just not quite out of his anesthesia yet. He's a teenager, and the nurse was doing her thing, and there was something that was just, I can't remember what she tried to grab. It was just slightly out of reach of her hand. And so she was working on the patient, but she just literally, in the moment it took for her to reach over to grab whatever it was, I don't remember what it was she grabbed, because what I remember what happened at that very instant, this kid kind of pops out of his anesthesia, but in the process, with his hand, he rips out his IV. Rips it out of his arm. Now, I had seen movies where when people get cut, there's blood splattering everywhere. I always thought that was movie magic, that didn't really happen. But I discovered live in front of me that when you do rip out an IV, this fountain of blood shoots out, and because he had moved his arm, because he's not quite conscious, it just sprayed the area we were in with his blood. And of course, they immediately take care of it, and she calls for help, and this, that, and the other. And I stood there shocked, because I had no idea people could bleed that much that blood could shoot out that far. And I remember standing there like, wow. They never asked me if, in my interview, would the sight of blood bother me? Because I know some people would probably keel over and faint, And I was just like, wow, I didn't know blood shot out that far. So anyhow, I was calm, cool, collected. I didn't like bat an eye, but everybody like panicked. The family did, but the nurse was calm. The Baylor staff was amazing. I mean, they took care of that. I mean, he was fine in, I think, 30 seconds. They had it totally under control. So kudos to Baylor. It's a really good hospital, the one here in Dallas. Anyway, but I'm thinking, nobody asked me about the sight of blood. But then we continued with the job. So that's how I ended up being an interpreter, because of the economic necessity. And then, of course, the economy improved, but I kept the jobs. I still work for both companies. Not so much the telephonics as much. Though basically they will call me, because what has happened since then and over the years, we're talking about 2008 is when I started with all this. They had picked up Emergency Services 911, the not Masterword, which is in Houston, but CTS Language Link, or they're now known as just Language Link, out of Washington, 911. And they trained us for how to handle 911 calls, and how to translate for 911, because it's a little bit different what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to greet the person, because the person's going to think you're the 911 operator when you're not, but how to handle 911 calls. And it so happened that it was quite dramatic, because this woman called in a panic 911. There was no, I forget where they were, but where they were in the country, but it was basically an area where they didn't have many 911 Spanish-speaking operators. And she's on the phone telling us that this man she knows, who she dated, is trying to break into her house. And please send the police immediately. And while I'm on the phone, I can hear the sound of the door of this house breaking down. And the woman screaming. And then all of a sudden, I hear a gunshot sound. And you hear a thud, like a human body has hit the floor. And the sound of the woman gasping. And it became quite evident that he had just shot her. And when she fell, she was moaning. And then you could hear the footsteps of the man checking on her, cursing up in Spanish. Obviously, he didn't realize she had a phone. And as I later found out, her phone kind of fell under a piece of furniture, but it was still on. They immediately informed me, see, the language company was listening into the call, and they all of a sudden they just jumped in and said, we're going to hang up so you can get a better clarity of what's happening. So now what was happening is I was inside the home on their phone, listening to the man, and then coordinating with the officers. 911 patched me into, because basically it became a standoff in this house with the police outside. And I was having to communicate to the officers outside how I could hear them, because he was pacing, and sometimes I could hear his footsteps really clearly when he was getting closer to the phone and when it was going away. He was also talking to himself quite a bit, so I was letting them know what he was saying, cursing up a storm, but I could tell whether he was in the room or in a different place, so that the police could coordinate if they're going to storm the house and try to figure out where she was. At one point when he was away, the woman kind of regained a bit of consciousness and informed us she was in her bedroom, and that he was now in the living room, in between very broken and quiet breaths. She was still in agony. You could hear her breathing very heavily, but she was able to express that. So I was able to inform the police officer. Anyhow, about 3 hours later, he gave up, and the police went into the house, and they got to her, and they got to the phone, and they let me know that she was still alive, and they had the ambulance. It was such an intense thing. And I kept my calm and cool. With that, then I guess they flagged me as somebody who could handle a high pressure situation without losing it. And so then other police kind of work when they needed an interpreter, like in remote, North Dakota, where they don't have that many Spanish speakers, or in rural Utah, or in Wyoming, in these rural areas of the country. Sometimes they need an interpreter for the police and in investigations, and they can't get a live person, so they will call me. and then I will handle those over the phone. If with Masterword, what happens is with CPS, sometimes there's a criminal case involving CPS. In other words, the CPS case is risen to the level that there's been a major crime. And there was one in particular instance, and where I was working with a CPS worker in the middle of the night. It was a really horrific case, and the police was there, and they had a Spanish-speaking officer, an investigator, and the guy was not wanting to talk to the guy. The officer, even though he was bilingual, you could tell he was from Texas because he had the Tejano Spanish. Where I'm from central rural Mexico, so I have like a local accent from central Mexico, and the man had heard me speaking Spanish, and he point blank said, "I will only talk to him," meaning me, because he felt like I'm a buddy because I'm from the same part of Mexico he was from. And so the police were like, well, since he's here and he's technically working for CPS, can we use them? And the CPS is like, well, we need to get the answers too, because we need to interview him too. So in tandem, they utilized me for that. And it was a really horrific crime that he had committed. What he did to one of his children, it was just monstrous. I remember the detective guy, the young detective who was Hispanic, got a little bit upset because the man was not going to talk to him, but he wanted to talk to me. And he confessed to the crime, which made the job for the police and prosecution later on much easier. And so then, because I did such a good job for them, then I get calls a lot for really horrible cases because they know I keep my cool. I don't lose it. I'm able to handle high stress situations, and since then I've done everything from all types of criminal and sexual abuse cases, sexual slavery cases. There was even a case of possession where someone believed their child was possessed by the devil, and we witnessed this transformation of this child, and it freaked everybody out in the room except me. And in fact, I had to because we're there just to interpret. We're not there to speak on behalf of anybody. I'm there just to interpret, but if I see as an interpreter, we also have an oath. We have to take an oath of ethics, and if we see if there's a situation that is being mishandled, it is our obligation to speak up. And so I did, and requested. I told the worker, "You need to get a supervisor here because this case is too complicated." And she was brand new, and I was like, and I had done this now for years, and I said, "You need backup," basically. So that's the thing about being an interpreter. So there's all kinds of interpreters. Not all kinds of interpreters do the kind of work I do. I tend to do more extreme cases because I'm known to be able to handle those. But yeah, that's how you become an interpreter. This video is long enough, so I will let you set off. If you have any other questions, you can always put it down below, and I'll try to answer them. And thank you for watching. Have a good evening if you watch this tonight, or if you watch this tomorrow during the day, good morning or good afternoon. And don't forget to ring the notification bell and like this video. Share it if you want for the people who want to be interpreters. You can hear some of these stories. And wear your masks, everybody. Have a good one. Bye.